On the night of November 28, 1944, a ghost slipped from its earthly bonds. Under a sliver of a moon, veiled by the high, thin clouds that scudded across the Japanese archipelago, the largest and most secret warship ever conceived eased out of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. She was a phantom born of desperation and defiance, a steel behemoth whose very existence was a state secret. Her name was Shinano. She moved with an unnatural silence for a vessel of her size. At 70,000 tons fully loaded, she displaced more water than any ship afloat. Yet the only sounds were the hushed commands on her bridge, the low thrum of her untried turbines, and the sigh of the cold November sea parting before her immense bow. She smelled not of battle and salt, but of fresh paint, raw steel, and the lingering scent of welding torches, the odor of a creation rushed from its womb before its time. Her flight deck, an expanse of steel and wood stretching 872 feet, was a barren, wind-swept plain. No aircraft were yet ranged upon it. No pilots waited in ready rooms below. She was a carrier without wings, a titan without its thunder. Below decks, the ship was a labyrinth of half-realized potential. Hundreds of pipes lay unconnected, their ends capped and waiting. Watertight doors, newly hung, had never felt the crushing test of water pressure. Compartments lacked intercoms, forcing sailors to act as runners, their frantic footsteps echoing in the hollow, unfinished corridors. On her bridge, Captain Toshio Abe felt the immense sluggish power of the vessel beneath him. A veteran of the old school, a man who had seen the glory of the Imperial Japanese Navy at its zenith, was now entrusted with its last, best hope. He knew the ship was not ready. Every officer, every yard worker who had toiled on her knew it. She was a wounded giant being sent out into a storm with a skeleton crew of trained sailors supplemented by civilian mechanics and raw recruits who were still learning how to navigate her steel canyons. But the orders from Tokyo had been absolute, driven by a gnawing fear. American B-29s, the new silver gods of the sky, had been photographed over Yokosuka. The fear was that this unsinkable symbol would be shattered in her cradle before she ever tasted the open sea. So under the cloak of darkness, the Shinano sailed. Her mission was a simple transit, a dash from Yokosuka to the relative safety of Kure Naval Base, where she would be completed, fitted out, and given her air wing. She was escorted by 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Hamakaze, and the legendary unsinkable Yukikaze, ships crewed by veterans who had seen the hell of the Pacific War. Yet even they were shadows flitting around a larger, more vulnerable shadow, unaware that the very waters they traversed no longer belonged to their emperor. The Pacific was now an American lake, and beneath its waves, hunters were waiting. One of those hunters was the USS Archerfish, a fleet submarine on its 5th war patrol. And at its heart was its commander, Joseph F. Enright, a man haunted by his own ghost. This voyage was for him a quest for redemption. Neither crew, the Japanese on their nascent supercarrier, nor the Americans in their submerged steel tube, knew it yet, but in the vast, indifferent darkness of the Pacific, their fates were converging. The next few hours would not be a thunderous clash of fleets, but a quiet, deadly ballet of patience, precision, and hubris. It would be a story that rewrote the rules of naval warfare, proving that in the modern age, the greatest giants could be felled by a single, silent, perfectly placed blow. To understand the Shinano is to understand the depth of the wound inflicted upon the Imperial Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. June 4, 1942, was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual cataclysm. In the span of a single day, the pride of the fleet, the 4 elite carriers of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were transformed into burning pyres on the ocean. With them died hundreds of Japan's finest naval aviators, an irreplaceable cadre of men who had dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility was shattered. In the somber halls of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, a desperate search for a solution began. Japan's industrial capacity could not compete with the American behemoth, which was launching new Essex-class carriers at a staggering rate. They could not win a war of attrition. They needed a symbol, a technological marvel that could restore both pride and power. They needed a fortress. Their eyes turned to a colossal, unfinished hull resting in the Yokosuka dry dock. It was the 3rd child of the Yamato class, the most powerful battleships ever conceived. Her sisters, Yamato and Musashi, were the embodiment of the Kantai Ketsen, the decisive battle doctrine, the belief that a single cataclysmic clash of super battleships would win the war. They were floating fortresses, armed with monstrous 18.1-inch guns and protected by armor so thick it was believed to be impervious to any weapon. But Midway had proven the age of the battleship was over. The aircraft carrier was now the queen of the seas. A radical and secret decision was made. The 3rd Yamato-class hull would not be a battleship. She would be converted into something entirely new. She would become the Shinano. The conversion was a project of breathtaking ambition and profound compromise. She was not designed to be a frontline strike carrier like her lost sisters. Instead, she was envisioned as a massive support carrier, a floating base that could ferry replacement aircraft, fuel, bombs, and repair crews to the forward carrier fleets. She was to be the linchpin, the logistical heart that would keep the wounded fleet fighting. Her battleship heritage gave her an unparalleled level of protection. Her armored belt, a slab of steel over 16 inches thick at the waterline, was designed to withstand the impact of battle shells. Her flight deck was also heavily armored, a 3-inch layer of steel over a 1-inch supporting plate intended to shrug off 1,000-pound bombs. Her designers, clinging to the old doctrines, boasted that she could absorb a dozen torpedo hits and remain afloat. In the minds of the Admiralty, she was not merely a ship. She was a declaration. She was proof that Japanese engineering, spirit, and will could still produce an unsinkable vessel, a fortress that would turn the tide of the war.
But hubris was being welded into her very frame. The conversion was a frantic race against time. As the American war machine ground closer to the home islands, the pressure to complete her intensified. Safety protocols were bypassed. Experienced shipwrights were being conscripted into the army, replaced by unskilled laborers, students, and even Korean conscripts. The quality of the workmanship, once a point of immense national pride, began to suffer. Welds were imperfect, rivets were poorly set. The design itself contained a fatal flaw born from her battleship origins. The juncture between the immense main armor belt and the much thinner anti-torpedo bulge below the waterline was a point of structural weakness. It was a seam in her invulnerable armor, a chink that would have devastating consequences. Furthermore, the focus on heavy armor came at the expense of internal subdivision and damage control systems. The designers, so confident in her ability to withstand punishment from the outside, neglected to fully consider how she would fight an enemy from within, the relentless ingress of the sea. By late 1944, the Japan that had launched the Shinano project was a shadow of its former self. The war was irretrievably lost, American submarines had effectively blockaded the home islands, strangling the flow of oil and raw materials. Fuel shortages were so severe that the remaining ships of the Imperial Navy were often confined to port, becoming little more than floating anti-aircraft batteries. American B-29s began their relentless firebombing campaigns, turning Japanese cities into infernos. Yet, in the shrouded dry dock of Yokosuka, work on the Shinano continued under strict blackout conditions. She became a symbol of delusion, a denial of the grim reality closing in on all sides. She was a project that could not be allowed to fail, because to admit her vulnerability was to admit that the war and the empire itself was doomed. Half a world away from the desperate shipyards of Japan, the men of the American Silent Service waged a relentless and brutally effective campaign. Aboard the USS Archerfish, SS-311, the atmosphere was one of quiet, professional tension. Life on a World War II Gato-class submarine was a unique form of sensory deprivation and overload. It was a world of cramped spaces, the pervasive smell of diesel fuel, recycled air, and unwashed bodies. It was a world of discipline, camaraderie, and long stretches of crushing boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-stopping terror. The soul of the Archerfish was her commanding officer, Commander Joseph F. Enright. Enright was a skilled submariner, but he was a man with something to prove. On a previous patrol, as commander of the USS Dace, he had made contact with a significant Japanese task force. Bound by doctrine that prioritized caution and forbade risking his boat on a surface attack without a perfect setup, he had allowed the opportunity to slip away. Though his actions were justifiable, a cloud of self-doubt and quiet criticism had followed him. He had been temporarily relieved of command and sent to a shore assignment, a submariner's purgatory. Now he was back. Given a second chance with the Archerfish, he was determined to erase the stain of that missed opportunity. He was not reckless, but he was hungry. He craved a clean, decisive engagement, a chance to prove to his crew, to the Navy, and most of all to himself, that he possessed the requisite blend of patience and aggression that defined the great submarine commanders. His crew sensed this quiet determination. They trusted him, and they were ready to follow him into the jaws of hell. On the evening of November 28, 1944, Archerfish was patrolling a designated sector south of the entrance to Tokyo Bay. It was a prime hunting ground, a known transit lane for Japanese shipping. For days, the patrol had been fruitless. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, marked by the steady hum of the electric motors and the rhythmic ping of the sonar. Then, at 20:48, it happened. A faint, ethereal blip appeared on the screen of the new SJ radar set. The radar man, his voice tight with controlled excitement, called out the contact. Radar contact, bearing 020, range 25,000 yards. Enright was in the conning tower in seconds. The contact was distant, large, and moving fast, far too fast for a merchant convoy. It was also zigzagging, a classic evasive maneuver for a high-value target. This was no freighter. Up periscope. The polished steel cylinder hissed upwards. Enright pressed his eyes to the optics, his hands gripping the handles. The sea was dark, the moon a faint glimmer behind the clouds. And then he saw it. A silhouette, a dark, impossibly massive shape against the slightly less dark horizon. It was colossal, far larger than any cruiser or battleship he had ever seen catalogued. It had the flat top of a carrier, but its scale was wrong. It defied all known intelligence. "What the hell is that?" a voice whispered in the crowded conning tower. Enright radioed the contact report to headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The response was silence. There was no known Japanese ship matching that description in that area. He was on his own. The ghost of his past command whispered caution in his ear, but the sight of that immense target, a whale in a sea of minnows, awakened the hunter within him. He made the call that would define his life. "We're going after her," he announced, his voice steady. "We'll shadow her all night. We wait for our shot." Thus began one of the most remarkable pursuits in the history of submarine warfare. For the next 6 hours, the Archerfish played a deadly game of cat and mouse. On the surface, the submarine was fast enough to keep pace with the zigzagging target, which was making a steady 20 knots. But staying on the surface was a tremendous risk. The carrier was screened by destroyers, whose lookouts could spot the low profile of the submarine at any moment. Enright conducted the chase with a surgeon's precision. He would drive the Archerfish ahead on a parallel course, then submerge to periscope depth for a quick observation, confirming the target's course and speed. He held a stopwatch in his hand, meticulously timing the giant's zigs and zags, plotting her pattern, trying to anticipate her next move. Inside the cramped control room, the atmosphere was electric. Crewmen, stripped to the waist in the sweltering heat, whispered updates. The air was thick with diesel fumes and sweat, but the tension was truly suffocating. Every man knew the stakes. Through the periscope, Enright watched the drama unfold in brief, tantalizing glimpses. The monstrous carrier, a moving mountain of steel. The 3 destroyers, weaving back and forth like sheepdogs guarding their prize. He could feel the frustration building. The target was too fast. His angle of attack was all wronged. He couldn't get ahead of her to set up a classic ambush. It seemed as though this ghost, too, might slip through his fingers.
Aboard the Shinano, a sense of unease had begun to settle in. The ship's propellers were suffering from a bearing problem, a consequence of her rushed construction. One of the shafts was overheating, forcing a reduction in speed. More critically, Captain Abe was worried. He believed his ship had been detected by an American submarine. The constant, disciplined zigzagging was his primary defense. His lookouts strained their eyes in the darkness, but the low-slung American sub remained invisible. Abe was faced with a classic captain's dilemma. He was pushing his new, untried ship and her green crew too hard. The overheating bearing was a symptom of a deeper malaise, but the alternative, slowing down, would make him an easier target. He decided to alter his base course, hoping to throw off any potential pursuer. He ordered a turn to the south, aiming for the deeper waters of the open ocean before making his final run towards Kure. It was the single greatest mistake of his life. Down below, in the conning tower of the Archerfish, Joseph Enright was on the verge of giving up the chase. His quarry was still too fast, and dawn was approaching. His chance was slipping away. He ordered one last look through the periscope, and then he saw it. At 3 a.m., the impossible happened. The massive silhouette began to turn. It wasn't turning away, it was turning towards him. Abe's precautionary course change was bringing the Shinano directly across the Archerfish's bow. The hunter, who had been fruitlessly chasing his prey from behind, was suddenly and miraculously in the perfect ambush position. The ghost was no longer running away. It was presenting its vulnerable flank. "He's turning right into our lap," Enright breathed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and elation. The tension in the conning tower snapped, replaced by a surge of focused adrenaline. The 6 hours of patient stalking were about to pay off. The orders came in a calm, clipped staccato, the culmination of endless drills. "Make ready tubes 1 through 6. Set depth 10 feet. Tubes 1 through 6 ready, sir. Match periscope bearing. Bearing a steady." The interior of the submarine was a study in controlled chaos. Men moved with a fluid, practiced grace, their faces illuminated by the dim red glow of the battle lanterns. In the forward torpedo room, the fish were ready, their gyros spinning with a low hum. Enright took one final look. The target was magnificent and terrible, a black wall of steel filling his view. He could see the waves breaking against her hull. He made a final calculation, aiming for the thickest part of the hull just aft the bridge. He set his torpedoes to run shallow, hoping to strike beneath the main armor belt. "Stand by." The entire crew held its breath. The only sound was the faint hum of the machinery and the pounding of their own hearts. "Fire one." A slight shudder ran through the Archerfish as the first 2,000-pound Mark 14 torpedo was ejected by a blast of compressed air. "Fire two." Another shudder. Enright kept his eye glued to the periscope, calling out the shots. "Fire three. Fire four. Fire five. Fire six." In the space of a few seconds, 6 torpedoes were streaking towards the Shinano, their propellers churning the water into a phosphorescent trail. Now came the longest seconds of a submariner's life, the agonizing wait. Enright lowered the periscope and gave the order he had been waiting his whole career to give decisively. "Take her deep. Rig for depth charge. Silent running." The Archerfish angled down sharply, diving for the crushing safety of the depths. As they descended, the sonar operator, his headphones pressed tightly to his ears, began calling out the time. 40 seconds. 41. 42. At 3:17 it came. A deep, resonant boom that was felt as much as it was heard, a concussion that vibrated through the submarine's hull. It was followed moments later by 3 more equally violent explosions, rolling through the water like underwater thunder. Boom, boom, boom. A spontaneous, muffled cheer erupted through the submarine, quickly suppressed. They had hit her. 4 solid hits out of 6 torpedoes fired. It was a spectacular feat of gunnery. Enright and his crew waited, tense for the inevitable counterattack. They expected the angry destroyers to be overhead any second, raining down a hellstorm of depth charges. But the sea remained silent. No high-speed screws of pursuing warships, no explosions. Only the distant, dull thumps of what sounded like secondary explosions from within the stricken giant. It was an eerie, unsettling silence. They didn't know it yet, but they had just mortally wounded the largest warship in the world. They had struck a blow from which the ghost of the Japanese Navy would never recover. Aboard the Shinano, the 4 torpedo impacts felt like the hammer blows of a vengeful god. The entire 70,000-ton structure shuddered violently. Steel plates groaned and tore. In the enlisted men's quarters, sailors were thrown from their bunks. On the bridge, officers grabbed for handholds to keep their feet. Lights flickered and died, plunging vast sections of the ship into a terrifying, chaotic darkness. The torpedoes had struck along the starboard side, precisely at the weak seam where the armor belt met the anti-torpedo bulge. They hadn't punched through the main armor, but they had ruptured the thinner plates below, tearing open the ship's hull and defeating the flawed bulge protection system. The sea, cold and black, rushed in. 3 of the ship's 12 boiler rooms flooded almost instantly, the water engulfing the massive furnaces and scalding sailors to death in a cloud of superheated steam. A compressed air tank exploded, killing every man in a nearby damage control station. The starboard outboard propeller shaft room was breached, and the sea flooded in around the massive, still-spinning shaft. Confusion reigned. The ship was so new and incomplete that its damage control infrastructure was a fiction. The intercom system was not fully installed, forcing runners to carry messages through darkened, increasingly treacherous corridors. Many of the pumps required for dewatering the ship had not yet been installed, and those that were in place quickly failed due to power outages or overwhelmed by the sheer volume of water. Worst of all were the watertight doors, hundreds of them, separating the ship into a honeycomb of compartments designed to contain flooding, had been so newly installed that their seals had never been tested. Under the immense pressure of the invading sea, they began to buckle and leak. Gaskets failed. Water poured not just into the breached compartments, but surged from one sealed section to the next, a cascading failure that doomed the ship from the inside out. On the bridge, Captain Abe struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. He was an experienced officer, a veteran of destroyers and cruisers, but he was a stranger to this new, unique vessel. His belief in the Shinano's battleship-derived toughness was absolute. He had been told she could survive a dozen torpedoes. 4 should be a trifle. Convinced that the damage was manageable and that her ship was in no mortal danger, he made his second fatal error of the night. Instead of stopping the ship to assess the damage and properly organize control efforts, he ordered the Shinano to maintain flank speed. His goal was to make a run for the shallow coastal waters of Shiono Point, where he could beach the carrier if necessary. But speed was now his enemy. The forward motion of the massive ship acted like a scoop, forcing even more water into the gaping holes on her starboard side. The flooding, already severe, accelerated dramatically. Within 30 minutes, the Shinano was listing 5 degrees to starboard. It was a noticeable, uncomfortable angle. Damage control teams, a disorganized collection of experienced sailors and terrified yard workers, fought a heroic but hopeless battle. They tried to shore up bulkheads with wooden beams. They stuffed mattresses and hammocks into leaking gaskets. They used wrenches to desperately tighten fittings that were shaking loose from the ship's vibrations. But it was like trying to stop a tsunami with a teacup. By 5 a.m., the list had increased to 10 degrees. The ship was becoming sluggish and difficult to steer. Officers continued to reassure the crew, their confident words a stark contrast to the growing fear in their eyes. The ship's unsinkable reputation was a powerful opiate, and many still believed she would survive. As the first gray light of dawn broke over the horizon on November 29th, the true horror of the situation became apparent. The sea was now pouring into the upper decks. The escorting destroyers, which had been unable to approach in the dark, now circled the wounded giant, their crews watching in stunned disbelief. The Shinano, the pride of the empire, was visibly dying. Her speed dropped to 10 knots, then to 6. The remaining boiler rooms began to flood, starved of fuel or overcome by fumes. At 7 a.m., 7 hours after the attack, the Shinano's massive engines fell silent. She stopped dead in the water, her list now a precarious 15 degrees. Sailors began to crowd the high port side of the flight deck, a silent, grim-faced assembly staring out at the destroyers, waiting for the order that seemed inevitable. But Captain Abe, trapped by his pride and the code of Bushido, refused to give it. To abandon ship now would be a monumental disgrace. He still believed she could be saved. He ordered the destroyers to attempt to tow her. Lines were passed, but the immense dead weight of the waterlogged carrier was too much. The tow cable snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. By 9 a.m., the list had passed 20 degrees. The laws of physics were now inexorable. The angle of the deck became so steep that men could no longer stand. Equipment broke loose and crashed across the decks. The breakdown of discipline began. Panicked crewmen started jumping into the cold sea on their own, preferring a chance in the water than being trapped in a steel coffin. Below decks, a far worse tragedy was unfolding. As compartments flooded with terrifying speed, watertight doors, now jammed by the angle of the ship, trapped hundreds of men in darkness. Their final moments are unrecorded. At 10:18 a.m., with the list past 30 degrees and the sea washing over the flight deck, Captain Abe finally faced the truth. The ship was lost. He gave the order, "All hands abandon ship." He then retired to his sea cabin, choosing to go down with his command, a final, futile act of honor in a world that no longer had a place for it. It was too late for an organized evacuation. The great ship was in her death throes. At 10:57 a.m., just under 7 hours after being hit, the Shinano heeled over completely. Her massive stern rose high into the air, exposing her propellers to the sky. For a moment, she hung there, a monument to a broken dream. Then, with a groan of tortured steel and a great rush of escaping air, she slipped beneath the waves, stern first. The sea, which had been her adversary all night, closed over her in a turmoil of foam and debris. Then there was only silence. Of roughly 2,400 men aboard, only 1,080 were pulled from the frigid water by the destroyers. Over 1,400 souls, including Captain Abe, went down with her. The largest, most powerful aircraft carrier in the world had been sunk on her maiden voyage after only 17 hours at sea, before she ever launched a single plane. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the loss was a secret and catastrophic humiliation. In Tokyo, the news was met with stunned disbelief, which quickly hardened into a policy of absolute silence. The Navy's high command suppressed all reports of the disaster. The surviving crew of the Shinano were rescued, then immediately isolated and confined to barracks, sworn to secrecy under threat of imprisonment or worse. The Japanese public would not learn of the existence, let alone the sinking, of their supercarrier until after the war was over. The ghost ship returned to being a ghost. Aboard the Archerfish, there was elation, but also uncertainty. Commander Enright reported that he had sunk a large carrier, but his claim was met with skepticism at Pearl Harbor. Allied intelligence had no record of such a vessel. Analysts assumed he must have mistaken a smaller ship or exaggerated the size. The kill was officially credited as a 28,000-ton Hayataka-class carrier. It was only after the war, when American intelligence officers began interrogating Japanese officials and poring over their records, that the unbelievable truth emerged. Joseph Enright and the crew of the Archerfish had indeed sunk a 70,000-ton supercarrier. For his incredible achievement, Enright was awarded the Navy Cross. His redemption was complete. The Archerfish received the Presidential Unit Citation. It remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine in history. The story of the Shinano is more than a footnote in naval history. It is a profound allegory. She was a monument to the end of an era where sheer size and thick armor were believed to be the ultimate measure of strength. She was a steel titan with feet of clay, a symbol of an empire's hubris, powerful on the outside, but rushed, flawed, and rotten within. Her sinking proved that the new arbiters of naval warfare were not brute force and tonnage, but stealth, technology, training, and precision. The silent, patient hunter had triumphed over the loud, arrogant giant. No photographs survive of the Shinano underway. She exists only in a handful of construction photos, a few rusting blueprints, and the haunting memories of those who built and lost her. She never had a combat record, never launched an air group, never tasted victory. Her legacy is one of failure. Yet in that failure, there is a powerful and enduring lesson. Her story is not one of grand battles or dramatic gunfire. It is a quiet story about the slow, inevitable collapse of a misplaced faith in invincibility. It is a testament to the fact that the most formidable fortress can be brought down by the smallest, well-placed crack in its foundation. In the end, it was silence that won. The silent passage of a single submarine, guided by a disciplined and patient commander, erased 4 years of imperial ambition in a single night. And as the dark waters of the Pacific closed over the Shinano, they closed over the age of the supership itself, leaving only the quiet, unforgiving silence of the deep.